I never really considered myself much of an urban explorer, but there was something about the way the late afternoon sun hit the rusted, jagged gates of the old forest fantasy park that made me pull my car onto the gravel shoulder. It had been officially closed since the summer of 1994, a victim of poor safety inspections and the arrival of a much larger, shinier corporate competitor only an hour down the interstate. The chain-link fence was almost entirely obscured by thick, strangling vines of ivy that felt more like a heavy, suffocating blanket than a living plant. I remember checking my phone and seeing I only had a single, flickering bar of service, but the curiosity was a physical itch in the back of my throat that I simply had to scratch. I squeezed through a narrow gap where the fence had been violently peeled back by someone much smaller than me, feeling the cold, jagged metal snag on my denim jacket with a sharp, protesting screech. The air inside the park felt fundamentally different the moment I stepped over the perimeter, thick with the heavy scent of damp pine needles and that metallic, ozone tang you only find near heavy machinery that's been left to rot in the rain. I started walking down the main promenade, which was once a vibrant, neon-lit thoroughfare of popcorn stands and balloon vendors, but was now just a cracked, gray vein of asphalt being slowly reclaimed by the weeds. Every step I took felt unnervingly loud in the dead air, the sound of my heavy boots crushing dried, skeletal leaves echoing off the hollow shells of the boarded-up gift shops. I kept my hands shoved deep in my pockets, trying to shake the persistent feeling that I was being watched by the empty, rectangular window frames that looked like dark, vacant eyes. It's funny how silence can start to feel like a physical weight, pressing against your eardrums until you start to imagine sounds that aren't really there. I reached the first themed area, a little cluster of sagging buildings designed to look like a 1880s gold rush town. And that's when I saw the first animatronic. It was a tall, lanky figure dressed as a prospector, leaning against a fake wooden barrel with a rusted tin pan permanently gripped in its stiff, fiberglass hands. The skin, made of some kind of high-grade but now degraded silicone, was peeling away from the face in long, pale strips, revealing the dark, oily metal skeleton underneath. I paused for a long moment to snap a photo with my phone, the sudden flash feeling like a violent, unwelcome intrusion into the profound stillness of the abandoned park. As I turned my back to walk toward the skeletal remains of the carousel, I could have sworn I heard a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, like a heavy clock ticking inside a lead box. I told myself it was just the metal of the old rides expanding or contracting in the evening cooling. A perfectly logical explanation for a perfectly mundane sound. I didn't look back right away, forcing myself to focus on the intricate, hand-painted horses of the carousel that were now chipped, gray, and stripped of their former glory. When I finally did glance over my shoulder, the prospector's head seemed a bit more tilted than it had been a minute ago, as if it were trying to catch a better glimpse of my silhouette as I moved away. I laughed it off, a dry, nervous sound that died almost instantly in the open air, and convinced myself that the shifting angle of the sun was just playing tricks on my depth perception. I kept moving deeper into the park's overgrown heart, the shadows getting longer and stretching out like thin, grasping fingers across the cracked path. I found myself in the Critter Cove section, where a group of robotic animals were staged in a permanent, frozen band performance on a small, elevated outdoor stage. There was a bear with a moldy accordion, a rabbit with a splintered fiddle, and a large, bulbous frog sitting behind a drum kit that was now covered in a thick layer of green moss. The silence here was even more profound, broken only by the distant, lonely call of a single crow somewhere near the park's main entrance. I walked right up to the edge of the stage, the floorboards creaking under my weight with a series of sharp, rhythmic groans that sounded like a person complaining in their sleep. I reached out a hand to touch the bear's matted, damp fur, but I stopped abruptly when I noticed that its glass eyes were remarkably clean, completely devoid of the gray dust that covered everything else. I felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up the length of my spine, the kind of cold that starts in your marrow and works its way out to your skin in an instant. As I backed away from the stage, I watched the rabbit animatronic very closely, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. Its head didn't move with the jerky, mechanical stutter you'd expect from 30-year-old hydraulics. It moved in a slow, agonizingly smooth rotation that followed my path across the dirt clearing. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my dry throat as I realized that the clicking sound I'd heard earlier was completely missing now. I started to back away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on the stage for even a second, my eyes darting frantically from the bear to the frog to the rabbit. They were all doing it now, their heads slowly swiveling on their rusted, hidden necks, their dead glass eyes locked onto my face with an impossible, hungry intensity. I tripped over a fallen, rotten branch and scrambled backward, my palms scraping against the rough, cold asphalt as I struggled to regain my footing. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of heavy lead, rooted to the spot by a paralyzing, primal sense of dread. I realized then that the power shouldn't be on in this park, and even if it were, these machines were far too decayed to move with such predatory, quiet grace. I looked down at the base of the rabbit animatronic and saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A pair of muddy, modern work boots peeking out from beneath the frayed hem of the costume. These weren't machines moving on their own through some ghostly remnant of programming. There were actual people inside them, or people crouched directly behind them, physically manipulating the frames. I saw a flash of movement in the shadows of the sheriff's office across the way, a tall, thin shape that didn't look like a statue or a prop at all. It was a man, dressed in dark, grime-streaked clothing, standing perfectly still with his arms hanging loosely and awkwardly at his sides. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was so pale and gaunt that it looked like a mask of human skin, stretched tightly over a yellowing skull. He didn't say a single word, didn't shout a warning or threaten me with a weapon. He just stood there and watched me with a terrifying, vacant stare that felt like a physical weight. I finally found the strength to turn and bolt, my lungs burning with the cold air as I sprinted back toward the main promenade and the distant fence. Every time I glanced sideways through the trees, I saw another figure emerging from the ruins of the food stalls or the deep shadows of the roller coaster supports. They weren't running after me with high-speed aggression. They were just walking, a slow, coordinated advancement that felt more like a systematic harvest than a chase. I could hear them now, not the sound of gears or motors, but the soft, wet sound of dozens of feet stepping in unison through the tall, dry grass. I reached the gap in the fence and threw my body through it, the jagged metal tearing a long, deep gash in my forearm that I didn't even feel until I reached the safety of the car. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition, the engine's sudden roar feeling like the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. As I pulled away and swung the car around, the headlights swept across the park's entrance for one final, haunting second of illumination. There, standing right behind the gate I had just exited, were 4 of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark like a welcoming committee. They didn't try to climb the fence or follow me out into the public road. They just stood there, their heads all tilted at that same unnatural, inquisitive angle, watching my taillights fade into the distance. I drove for 3 hours without stopping, finally pulling into a bright, crowded gas station where the neon lights and the presence of other people felt like a shield. I tried to tell the police later that night, but what was I really going to say? That some people were standing very still in an abandoned park. I went home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those clean glass eyes reflecting the sudden, intrusive light of my camera flash. A week later, I was looking through the photos I'd taken on my laptop, zooming in on the background of the shots I thought were just of the scenery. In every single one, even the very first one I took at the front gate, there was a pale face or a dark, slender figure hidden just out of focus in the periphery. They had been watching me from the very moment I stepped out of my car, moving the animatronics like chess pieces to keep my attention distracted. I noticed something else in the very last photo I took of the Critter Cove stage before I panicked and ran for my life. The bear's mouth was slightly open, and if you look closely at the high-resolution crop of the image, you can see a human eye looking out from the darkness of the throat. I haven't left my apartment after the sun goes down since that day, and I've started noticing a dark, nondescript SUV parked down the street that never seems to move. Sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet, I hear a faint, rhythmic clicking sound coming from the hallway directly outside my front door. It sounds exactly like a clock ticking inside a lead box, or the sound of a heavy metal gear being forced to turn against years of rust. I don't check the peephole anymore, because I know with a sickening certainty that if I do, I'll see someone standing there with their head tilted just a little too far to the side. I just sit in my living room with every single light turned on, waiting for a morning that feels like it's never going to actually arrive. The worst part of all this isn't knowing they are there, but knowing exactly how patient they are capable of being. They spent decades in that park, perfectly still, just waiting for a curious soul to walk through the gate and provide them with a new reason to move. And now that I've seen them, I think they've decided that I'm the new attraction they've been waiting to bring back to the cove. My phone just buzzed with a notification from my doorbell camera, but I'm too terrified to even look at the glowing screen on the coffee table. I can hear the floorboards in the hall creaking now, that same slow, heavy groan I heard on the stage when I stepped on the rotten wood. It's not a ghost, and it's not a machine. It's something much worse because I can hear it breathing through the gap under the door. I can hear the breathing now, wet and ragged and heavy, right against the wood of the door as if they are listening to my heartbeat. I'm riding this because I need someone to know that the park isn't empty. It's just inhabited by things that have forgotten how to be human. If you ever see a rusted gate and a faded sign while driving through the woods, please, for the love of God, just keep your foot on the gas and keep driving. Don't look at the statues, and definitely don't look into their eyes, no matter how clean and shiny they look compared to the rust, because once they start turning their heads to watch you pass, they never, ever intend to stop. I never really liked heights, but there's something about the way a carnival looks from the top of a Ferris wheel that usually makes the nausea worth it. You get this view of the world where everything looks like a miniature model, all glowing lights and tiny people scurrying around like ants chasing spilled sugar. It was supposed to be the last ride of the night, a final quiet moment before my girlfriend and I headed back to the car, but she had backed out at the last second because of a sudden headache. I told her I'd only be 5 minutes, waving from the gondola as the ride op. A guy with a grease-stained cap and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in a week pulled the lever. The ascent was jerky and loud, the metal groaning under the weight of the rotating structure as I rose higher and higher above the dying pulse of the fairgrounds. By the time I reached the very apex, the highest point where the wind starts to whistle through the iron struts, the machine just stopped. At first, I didn't think much of it, because these old rides always pause to let people on and off at the bottom. I sat there swinging gently, checking my watch and realizing it was already 10 minutes past midnight, which was when the park was officially supposed to close. I looked down, expecting to see a line of people waiting to disembark, but the loading platform was completely empty. The operator was gone, his little wooden control booth dark and abandoned, and the bright, neon-colored lights of the midway were flickering out one by one. I called out a tentative hello, but my voice was swallowed instantly by the vast, open air and the rustling of the oak trees that ringed the perimeter of the park. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night breeze crawled up my spine as I realized the hum of the generator had died completely. It's a very specific kind of silence that settles over a place like that. A heavy, expectant quiet that makes you feel like you're trespassing in a place that no longer belongs to the living. I pulled my phone out to call Sarah, but the battery icon flashed red, and the screen went black before I could even hit the contact list. I cursed my luck, gripping the cold safety bar so hard my knuckles turned white, and tried to convince myself that the operator had just gone to use the bathroom or grab a coffee. The woods surrounding the park were deep and dense, a wall of black timber that seemed to press inward now that the artificial lights were fading. I looked toward the tree line, trying to find the glow of the parking lot, but all I saw was the rhythmic swaying of the branches. That was when I noticed the first anomaly, a slight movement near the base of a massive, ancient elm tree right at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a pale shape, something light-colored and low to the ground, moving with a strange, hitching gait that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. I squinted, leaning forward as much as the gondola would allow, trying to make sense of the blur in the darkness. It wasn't just one shape. As my eyes adjusted, I saw another, and then another, emerging from the shadows of the undergrowth. They were people, or at least they had the basic silhouette of people, but they were moving on all fours, their limbs elongated and thin. They were wearing what looked like white, tight-fitting jumpsuits, or perhaps they were just incredibly pale and unclothed. It was hard to tell from this height. They didn't make a sound as they filtered out of the woods, dozens of them, fanning out across the empty grass of the fairgrounds. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, praying they wouldn't look up and see me silhouetted against the moonlight. They moved with a disturbing, synchronized grace, sniffing at the discarded popcorn buckets and knocking over the trash cans with calculated precision. One of them stopped near the funhouse, its head snapping back with a sudden, jerky motion as it began to scan the horizon. I ducked my head down, pressing my face against the cracked vinyl of the seat, feeling the cold metal of the gondola frame vibrating against my shoulder. I could hear them now, a faint, wet clicking sound that rose up from the ground, like thousands of tiny pebbles being struck together. It was a language of sorts, a series of percussive signals that seemed to coordinate their movement across the park. I peeked over the edge again and saw that a group of them had gathered at the base of the Ferris wheel, their pale faces turned upward. They didn't have eyes in the way we do. Instead, there were dark, hollow pits that seemed to drink in the little light that was left. They weren't supernatural. I could tell by the way they breathed, the heavy, ragged heaving of their chests, and the way their muscles bunched under their skin. These were humans, or something that had once been human, twisted by some isolation or madness into something that lived in the dark spaces between the trees. One of them reached out and grabbed the metal support beam of the wheel, its fingers long and nimble, gripping the iron with terrifying strength. It began to climb, pulling itself up with a fluid, effortless motion that made my stomach do a slow, sick flip. The clicking sound grew louder, more frantic, as more of them began to swarm the base of the structure, their pale bodies looking like maggots writhing on a carcass. I looked around wildly for some way out, some way to jump or hide, but I was trapped 60 feet in the air with nowhere to go. I could hear the rhythmic clanging of the metal as the first one ascended, the vibration traveling up the frame and into the floor of my gondola. I tried to scream for help, but my throat was so dry it felt like it was lined with sandpaper, and only a weak, pathetic wheeze came out. The thing was halfway up now, its pale skin glistening with a thin sheen of sweat that looked like oil in the moonlight. I could see the grime under its fingernails, and the way its jaw hung slightly slack, revealing rows of teeth that had been filed down to sharp, jagged points. It wasn't a monster from a movie. It was a person who had decided to become something else, and that was so much worse. I realized then that the operator hadn't forgotten me. He had left me here on purpose, a final offering before the park went dark for the season. The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. The figure reached the gondola directly below mine, its hand reaching up to grasp the edge of the floorboards where I sat. I backed away as far as I could, my spine pressing against the opposite side of the small carriage, feeling the whole structure tilt precariously. I looked down and saw the others waiting at the bottom, their faces all tilted up in a silent, expectant circle. The hand that gripped my gondola was scarred and calloused, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles like parchment. I could smell them now, a heavy, cloying scent of wet earth, copper, and something sweet and rotting, like overripe fruit left in the sun. The figure's head rose above the level of the floor, and for a second, we made eye contact, the dark pits of its eyes reflecting nothing but the void. It didn't snarl or growl. It just stared with a terrifying, vacant intensity that suggested it didn't even see me as a person anymore. It was just a predator looking at a piece of meat that had been conveniently hung out of reach until now. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I'd brought in my jacket pocket, swinging it with every ounce of strength I had left. It connected with the thing's temple with a sickening thud, but it didn't fall. It just flinched, its grip on the metal tightening until the steel began to groan. Another one was right behind it, its pale fingers already curling around the support struts of my carriage. I looked toward the parking lot one last time, hoping to see the headlights of Sarah's car or the flashing blue of a police cruiser. But there was nothing but the endless, mocking blackness of the trees. The first figure pulled itself up, its torso clearing the edge of the gondola, and I realized it was wearing a tattered, filth-streaked uniform that looked remarkably like the one the ride operator had been wearing. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the gut, making my head swim and my vision blur at the edges. They weren't outsiders. They were the people who ran this place, the ones who stayed behind when the lights went out and the gates were locked. The humming grew louder, a vibrating wall of sound that seemed to paralyze my limbs and drown out the frantic thudding of my heart. I dropped the flashlight, watching it tumble through the air, its beam cutting a frantic arc through the dark before it shattered on the pavement far below. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out, leaving me in total, suffocating darkness with the pale things. I could feel the gondola lurch as the second one climbed in, the extra weight making the chain scream in protest. A hand, cold and damp as a cellar wall, reached out and brushed against my ankle, the fingers tracing the line of my sock with a curious, delicate touch. I pulled back, but there was nowhere left to go, my body wedged into the corner of the small metal cage. I closed my eyes, hoping that if I couldn't see them, they weren't really there. But the smell and the sound made that impossible. I could hear their breathing, synchronized and slow, a predatory rhythm that signaled the end of the wait. The clicking started again, soft and conversational, right next to my ear, as if they were discussing how to proceed. I felt the Ferris wheel lurch suddenly, the gears groaning as the whole structure began to move again. But it wasn't the smooth rotation of the motor. It was the weight of dozens of them, all climbing at once, shifting the balance of the wheel and forcing it to turn by sheer collective mass. We began to descend, inch by painful inch, as the pale figures at the bottom reached up to pull the gondola down toward the earth. I looked up and saw the stars, indifferent and cold, shining down on the empty park and the quiet woods. I wanted to pray, but the words wouldn't come, lost in the overwhelming tide of terror that had swallowed my mind. The gondola reached the halfway point, and I could see the faces of the ones on the ground more clearly now, their mouths open in silent, hungry anticipation. They didn't have weapons, and they didn't need them. They had numbers and a patience that was born of a lifetime in the shadows. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as teeth sank into the meat of my arm, and I finally found my voice, screaming into the night until my lungs burned. But there was no one to hear me, no one to come running, just the endless, rustling trees and the slow, heavy rotation of the wheel. The ground was only 20 feet away now, and the circle of pale figures began to close in, their movements becoming more fluid and frantic. I realized then that the ride was never going to stop, not for me, and not for anyone else who stayed too late. The park was their hunting ground, and the Ferris wheel was just a giant mechanical trap designed to keep the prey fresh until the sun went down. As the gondola touched the loading platform, a dozen pairs of pale hands reached in to greet me, and the last thing I felt was the cold, heavy weight of the dark. The clouds had been bruising the horizon since 3 in the afternoon, but I thought I could make it through the shortcut across Miller's Point Park before the sky actually decided to open up. It's one of those vast, sprawling municipal parks that feels more like a forgotten forest than a recreational area, especially during the off-season, when the small, seasonal boardwalk at the north end is shuttered for the winter. I was halfway across the gravel path near the old fairground section, when the first heavy drops of rain started slamming into the dry dirt, kicking up that sharp, metallic scent of petrichor that usually makes me feel nostalgic, but today just felt heavy and ominous. Within seconds, the drizzle transitioned into a blinding downpour that turned the world into a gray, shivering blur, making it impossible to see more than 10 feet in front of my face. I started running, my sneakers slipping on the slick grass as I looked for anything with a roof, eventually spotting the jagged, neon-faded silhouette of the Funhouse of Wonders, tucked away near the edge of the woods. It looked like a relic from a decade that didn't want it back, with peeling plywood boards painted in garish yellows and reds, and a giant, laughing clown face over the entrance that seemed to be grimacing in the strobe-like flashes of distant lightning. To my surprise, the heavy wooden door at the side was slightly ajar, rattling rhythmically against the frame as if the wind were trying to invite itself inside. I didn't think twice about the trespass, throwing my weight against the door and stumbling into the darkness of the interior, just as a deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundation of the building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, old sawdust, and that peculiar, sour scent of rotting carpet that you only find in places that have been closed to the sun for years. I stood there for a moment, panting, wiping the rain from my eyes, and waiting for my vision to adjust to the dim, amber light filtering in through the high, grime-streaked clerestory windows. The silence of the funhouse was a physical weight, broken only by the frantic drumming of rain on the corrugated metal roof high above, and the occasional groan of the building's wooden bones shifting in the gale. I realized I was in the transitional hallway leading to the mirror maze, a narrow corridor lined with those classic, warped glass panes that are supposed to make you look either 10 feet tall or as wide as a bus. I took a few steps forward, my footsteps sounding unnervingly loud on the hollow floorboards, feeling a sudden, irrational spike of anxiety about being trapped in such a claustrophobic, artificial environment. I told myself it was just the atmosphere, that the distorted versions of myself staring back from the silvered glass were just tricks of physics and poor lighting. I reached the entrance to the main hall, a sprawling room filled with dozens of floor-to-ceiling mirrors arranged in a complex geometric grid that created an infinite loop of empty, dark corridors. I decided to sit down near the entrance and wait out the storm, leaning my back against the cold glass of a corner mirror while I pulled out my phone to check the weather. The screen glowed harshly in the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows across the room, but the signal was dead, showing only a frustratingly empty bar and a spinning loading icon. I sighed and pocketed the phone, and that's when I noticed the first anomaly, a small, subtle hitch in the world that I almost dismissed as a trick of my tired eyes. Out of the corner of my right eye, I saw my reflection in the adjacent mirror move just a fraction of a second after I had already settled into a still position. It was as if the version of me in the glass had a slight lag, a momentary delay in its physics that made its final adjustment to its sitting posture feel intentional rather than reflective. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, and I stared directly at the reflection, watching its eyes, my eyes, stare back with the same wide-eyed intensity. I moved my right hand slowly, lifting a single finger, and the reflection mirrored the movement perfectly, its timing now seemingly back in sync with my own. I chuckled nervously, the sound echoing hollowly through the maze, and told myself that the uneven surface of the old glass was just creating a visual distortion as I shifted my weight. I stood up to find a more comfortable spot, and as I rose, I caught a glimpse of another reflection of myself about 3 mirrors deep into the maze. That version of me didn't stand up. It stayed crouched for a heartbeat longer than it should have, its head tilted at an angle that I wasn't currently mimicking. A cold shiver crawled up my spine, the kind that feels like a needle being dragged along your vertebrae, and I felt the hair on my arm stand straight up. I moved closer to that specific mirror, my breath hitching in my chest, and I saw the reflection finally stand up. But its movements were fluid and graceful in a way that felt entirely alien to my own clumsy gait. I stood perfectly still, my hands clenched at my sides, and I watched as the reflection in front of me slowly, deliberately raised its hand to its face and scratched its chin. I wasn't scratching my chin. My hands were still pinned to my thighs, the knuckles white from the pressure of my grip. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, a rhythmic thud that I could feel in my throat, making it hard to swallow the rising bile of pure, unadulterated terror. I backed away, but as I turned my head, I saw that every single reflection in the room was now doing something slightly different, a chaotic symphony of me that was no longer bound by the laws of light. One reflection was adjusted its collar, another was looking over its shoulder at something behind it, and a third was simply staring at me with a grin that was far wider and more predatory than any expression I had ever made in my life. I realized then that they weren't reflections at all, but people, or things, standing behind two-way glass, mimicking me with a precision that had been perfected through hours of observation. The funhouse wasn't abandoned. It was a hunting ground, and I had walked directly into the center of the trap. I turned to run back toward the side door, but the maze of mirrors seemed to have shifted. The corridors I thought I remembered now leading into dead ends of glass and silver. Every time I turned a corner, I was met with another version of myself, some of them now moving toward the glass, their hands pressing against the surface from the other side. I heard a soft, wet thud, the sound of a hand hitting glass, and then another, and another, until the room was filled with the rhythmic drumming of palms against the mirrors. I reached the wall where I thought the exit was, but instead of wood, I found only more mirrors, and when I looked into the one directly in front of me, the reflection wasn't mimicking me at all anymore. It was standing perfectly still, its face pressed against the glass, its eyes dilated until they were nothing but bottomless black voids. It raised a finger to its lips in a universal gesture for silence, and then it reached out and began to slowly, agonizingly push its hand through the surface of the glass as if it were nothing more than thick, dark water. The glass didn't shatter, it rippled, and I felt the sudden, terrifying warmth of another person's skin as its fingers brushed against my own. I screamed, a raw, jagged sound that was swallowed by the heavy insulation of the funhouse, and I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling onto the hard floor. As I lay there looking up, I saw dozens of me stepping out of their frames, their movements synchronized now, a slow, deliberate advance from every direction. They didn't speak, they didn't snarl, they just kept coming, their faces identical to mine, but their eyes filled with a hollow, hungry void that suggested they had been waiting for a long time to trade places. I managed to find a heavy metal trash can near a corner and swung it with everything I had at the mirror nearest the actual exit door I'd missed. Glass finally shattered, a beautiful, violent explosion of shards that revealed a dark, narrow maintenance crawlspace behind the wall. I didn't look back as I scrambled into the hole, the jagged edges of the broken frame slicing into my palms and knees, but I didn't feel the pain, only the desperate, primal need to get away. I crawled through the darkness, the sound of the rain getting louder, until I burst through a small ventilation hatch on the far side of the building and tumbled into the mud of the park. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, not stopping until I reached the bright, harsh lights of a gas station 2 miles away. I stood under the fluorescent hum of the awning, drenched and shaking, looking at my reflection in the glass of the front door. For a second, I thought I saw the version of me in the glass blink when I didn't, a tiny, infinitesimal delay that made my blood turn to ice. I haven't looked in a mirror since that night, covering every reflective surface in my apartment with heavy black sheets and tape. I can still hear the rhythmic tapping sometimes, a soft drumming against the other side of the glass, reminding me that they are still there, waiting for me to forget, waiting for me to look just a little too long so they can finish what they started. The rain hasn't stopped for 3 days, and every time I pass a window, I see a shadow that looks exactly like mine, standing just a bit too still, watching me from the gray, distorted world outside.